noon. So we will go ahead and get started. So welcome to our 6th session of the Forage Forum Friday. We're excited to have you with us again today. And so as we were kind of explaining ahead of time, we do have professional growth points for any of our ag teachers that may be on. So at the end of next week's session, I will be sending out an email to all of those and with a way to kind of record who had attended what sessions, and you'll get your certificate after you report on that. So with that, we will get started for today. So I'd like to introduce today, both myself and colleague down south, Miranda Edge, will be presenting today. We're going to talk about how to properly manage pastures. And so our objectives for today, we'll discuss the management of pastures. We'll kind of do a brief overview of a few different types of grazing systems, as next week I'll be going a little bit more in depth into rotational grazing. We'll also talk about why overgrazing is detrimental to our pasture quality and overall productivity. And then we'll talk about ways to prevent overgrazing. So Miranda, I'll let you do a little bit better introduction and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Yes, I am the Ag and Natural Resources Extension Educator in Harrison County, so almost into Kentucky. We are known for our cow and calf operations down here and lots of beautiful grazing hills. So I've got a lot of different scenarios that I've helped with here in the county and surrounding, and hopefully some of my stories and background can help you all today with managing of your pastures. Okay, Elysia, next slide, please. So starting with our grazing plan, I always like to say, what do you have? Whether you're starting with a pasture that's never been used, it's been overused and then left to sit fallow and gather in weeds. You're using croplands and converting that to a hay or a grazing lot for your livestock, depending on what your needs and your management systems are. Look at what you have first. And we always say, start from the bottom. Soil health is number one when it comes to preparing and managing those pastures. And I know that's something we probably ask every single time we talk to you is, have you done your soil sample? But really it is absolutely the most important thing to do when you get started on renovation systems management or anything that you would need to do to improve your pasture land. There are some certain weeds that like those poor soil healths. And so, weeds tend to be the one thing we see a lot of in those poor pastures and the things that people ask us, how do I get rid of, or how do I manage these? Well, again, we're going to say, let's look at your soil health. And some of those weeds will just be able to be removed, eradicated just by improving those soil conditions. Next slide, please. So for soil sampling, just remember that this is a whole field management, and you need to actually look at your field by how you intend to graze and manage it. And I like to tell people that if you aren't interested in specific areas and managing those specific areas separately from other areas of your pasture, don't take your samples separately. Manage the entire area the way you feel like you're going to be using it in your grazing system. Each area is about 10 to 20 subsamples that are spread evenly across the field. Zigzag patterns, uneven, running around with 3 or 4 different kids in a bucket. Whatever randomness you can do to grab those samples across the field will give you that whole field representative sample. And then from there, you're going to mix those together and grab one subsample to send to the lab and get your results back, either through our extension offices, or you can do those on your own. We have worked with SureTech. We work with A&L Laboratories. There's other ones out there available, but those are the two that I know here in Indiana that I work with on a regular basis and feel comfortable enough to help with recommendations on those reports. So when you're doing those, yes, Elysia.
Sorry, I was gonna say, so when you mix those samples together, do you want to use a plastic bucket, a metal bucket? What kind of container?
Oh, great. So a plastic bucket is the best option. If you're using a metal, you could have some higher metal numbers or levels in your samples just from that transfer over into the soil. So make sure that when you're taking those samples, they're going into a plastic bucket and that mixing of that is in that plastic bucket before going into your sampling. So good. Thanks for catching that, Elysia. Also be sure to use a sampling depth of 6 inches or tillage depth so that you're getting a full range of your growth for your root system and that health of the root system and the whole entire soil health levels are looked at within that particular sample. Next slide, please. And so the biggest reason that we like to look at that soil sample is, of course, our pH as well as the levels of nutrients in the soil. But we know there are certain species that can tolerate a lower pH than others. So knowing what's out there, we're going to realize and understand, why is your tall fescue not growing? Is the pH too high for it? Or is the pH too low for that sweet clover or the alfalfa that you just planted last week or last year rather? Is it just not growing because the pH level's not at the right location for those nutrients to be available to those plants? So real important, number one, is that pH level. And you can see from these different lists that there are specific plants that like a certain range of pHs, and that's why we really work on that and manage those separately, so that when you do have that diverse amount of plants within your pastures, that they're all going to be able to grow at a regular basis and that you don't have anything kind of up and down as far as your yield statuses over the year. Okay, next slide.
I'm say that Brian just made a great comment in the chat box. He says
Okay.
he uses a hose clamp on his soil probe, so he always goes down to the same depth.
Oh, that's fantastic. A great idea, Brian. Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to start using that idea.
Yeah.
Especially because I like to use the neighborhood kids to go out there and help me take those random samples, and that makes sure they all get them at the same level every time. Thanks for that, Brian. I appreciate that. Okay, so the other reason we try to talk about those is different pH levels and those nutrient samples is that your typical grazing calendar is not subject to just 1 or 2 months. Of course, we're looking at an entire season. You're going to have cool season versus warm seasons, legumes. You've got annuals, and then you've even got some miscellaneous forages like your corn stalks and even cover crops that are all going to graze at different levels of temperatures, pHs, and they all have different requirements for nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so we're looking at those and making a management plan. Using those soil analysis, the soil health will help you with expanding that grazing season and allowing more of these grazing plants to be available across your season. And then the other part then, of course, is, nope, you're good, that's fine. Adding in some different diversity and adding to that will expand that grazing season. And we can go a little more into depth on that with Elysia's talk later today, and then maybe even into next week as well. So now that we've kind of got an idea of what our soil health is, we've increased the fertilization in that, and it's got a good growth before these animals go on the pasture. Now what do we do? We've allowed that it's best to leave that pasture to grow to at least a 5 to 6 inches height before you start to graze. That, of course, as you let it go up more and more and more, you have a little bit more fiber and forage available for that animal. Of course, then you get to a point where it will seed out and your amount of nutrients available to the animal starts to actually reduce. So there is kind of a fine line there, but that management system of at least allowing for 5 to 6 inches of growth will allow the plant to be healthy as well as have enough forage for the animal to graze and consume the nutrients that they need. Adding a new grazing pasture to your plan can cause some issues. And I know that's the biggest question I usually get here in the spring is, I've just got a lush clover pasture. It frosted last night. Do I have to worry about bloat, poison, any toxicities? Well, yes, there is some issues that you have to look at. Your clover is usually not the ones for the toxicities with the acids. It's the bloat, the issue. And that's because of that upset in the animal's gut. You have lots of water. You have lots of extra nutrients that maybe they've not gotten available through their hay sources. And their gut's going to be empty. They're going to be like a kid in a candy shop. They go for the green. They are going to try to eat and eat and eat until their bellies are full. And then what happens to the kid in that candy shop? His stomach gets upset. Same thing happens with these livestock. So gradually increasing the amount of time they're able to graze in this new pasture is quite helpful. The other thing you might look at is adding that dry forage in the pasture so that they can have a gut fill of hay prior to going out and grazing, and being able to just kind of pass on and off within those dry forages and the fresh forages to keep that maintenance level and their gut kind of at a regular stage. Okay, go ahead. Now we've got this pasture that's 5 to 6 inches in height of plant material, and the animals that you've put into the pasture have now grazed it down to maybe 4 to 5 inches tall, or even less, to 2 to 3 inches tall. What happens then? It depends on what your grazing systems are, how you're going to manage those, as to how you're going to fix that problem or manage that problem. Rotations is a big part of grazing maintenance and allowing for those particular grasses and other plants to have a chance to recharge and regrow. We are normally, or not normally, but we are used to seeing a constant grazing management system where the entire lot is open for the animal to do their natural movement across the pasture. And I'll go into a little more detail on this later, but that may not be the best thing for your pasture. Yes, mentally and behaviorally for your animals, they're going to move like they would normally move to rotate themselves. However, because we've got them in a smaller area and we're not allowing them to do some major miles and miles of rotations on their own, we have to manage the amount of health and plant available to them over that distance of our acreage, whether that's 20 acres, 200 acres, 300 acres. It's still going to be a small enough area that they're not going to be able to manage it as well for the health of the plant. Okay, so let's look at how long does it take to get from your 8-inch, 6-inch mark to about your 4-inch mark in grazing. If it takes longer than a week, look at maybe shortening pastures. Temporary fences are a really good piece of technology, a piece of equipment to have on hand. I've got one that's on a reel, kind of like a fishing rod, where I can release it, set it up, tighten it all back up. It can be electric. I can add a charger to it so that it's got electric charge. It attaches to my normal fence. And I use that quite often to change the type of grazing management that I use with my sheep in particular. This allows then, of course, for those spaces that they're not grazing to be able to recharge, to regrow, and have a good establishment before we put them back on. If you're not able to get rotated through all of your pasture area before they get above that about 8 to 10-inch mark, and you know that the nutrients within that plant are starting to go back down, it's best and a good thing to go back to do some regular mowing so that it is a uniform cut across. Those stemmy seed heads that aren't really palatable and they have those low nutritive values are cut off. The seeds may drop, reseed the pasture a little bit, and help you out over the long run. Then, of course, those stems and things are going to die and add some more organic matter back to your soil and help with that soil health. Next, please.
So, Miranda, along those lines, instead of just mowing, could we also have somebody come in if we don't have our own equipment and make hay, possibly, if the acreage is large enough?
Well, yeah, absolutely. If you're able to do a dual purpose, of course, the best thing would be, of course, to be able to graze year round. But I don't know about you all, but here in southern Indiana, between ice and mud and snow, sometimes it's difficult to keep those animals on those different pastures. And Elysia is going to go through a little bit of that here in a minute. But at some point, we do want to pull those animals off of the pastures and have a hay available. So if you've got the available pasture space to make some hay before they're grazed, that is a great opportunity to dual purpose that land, especially if you're just now moving it into a grazing system out of crops or something else, where you've expanded your opportunities and you're going to be able to get more out of it.
And then we had another quick question real quick. So why does the grazing horizon, so kind of that starting height point, you had mentioned a couple of different heights. You had mentioned the 5 to 6 inches, and then you had mentioned the 8 to 10 inches. So what's the difference between those two?
Sure. So it depends on your type of plants and what you're grazing. I know that when we've done some field days with Dr. Johnson and even with, I think Robert Zupanzig's also told me this several times, is the eye of the animal. If you can see that eye, it's time to move. And so it kind of depends on the plant. It depends on the animal. And of course that nutritive value and when that particular plant seed heads out. There's no one particular system and guideline to tell you how to move animals within a rotation. 8 to 10 inches is about that rule of mark where they start to really drop in nutrition. So I don't like to see anything go above that 10 inches. However, 5 to 6 inches seems to be a pretty good value for all of those plants that are available or in your diverse group. To make a really great forage palatability mixture that brings the most nutrients. You've got low seed heads, and it's going to be plenty of forage and fibers for them to pick up and fill their gut. So I hope that answers the question.
Yep. And like you had said, it definitely depends on where you're at in your grazing, the season, how many animals you're grazing as well. And kind of what type of management. So if you're doing just basic rotational grazing, moving them once a day, once every few days, you're going to want a little bit more forage. If you're doing more of a managed intensive, you're probably going to be moving them a little bit quicker. So you could graze them at a little bit lower height, probably.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Elysia. Okay, so grazing maintenance, like I said before, is pulling them off. There's going to be a point in time where maybe it's just too muddy, or you've got, in my case, I had lambs coming. I didn't really want to have to run out to the end of the set of pastures to go watch lambs or try to move the whole herd back when they've got little baby lambs that maybe can't keep up with them. And so I've chose to create a stress lot for my particular grazing management, or you might hear them say a dry lot or a sacrifice pasture. Those are all kind of the same things where you're not going to put as much effort into making sure that the grass remains. You're going to be more concerned with dry footing, maybe a feed pad to help with managing of water runoff. This is where your hay will be most likely fed, unless you're doing a movement with that dry hay in the spring to help with leveling out the amount of green fibers and dry fibers, nutrients going into the animal. But this is going to be a very high traffic place. It's going to be a place where you're going to have mud, you're going to have some grossness to it, but being able to put in some sheltering and feed pads or gravel pads to where you can manage that a little bit better. This is going to help for your other pasture areas to recoup and not be damaged by those muddy feet. I know my lambs, they have those little itty bitty feet. They stomp and stomp and stomp into that mud. They're going to ruin that nice, lovely fescue pasture that has developed if I leave them out there. So if I can move them off of that and give that a little bit of relief, I'm going to be better off in the long run down the road, and maybe even be able to stockpile that a little bit for further grazing into the fall. Go ahead. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about those specific types of grazing. There's different grazing management systems, like we said, and it just depends on what you're doing and where. And I'll tell you this last year, I think I've used all of them on even one pasture. So it just depends on how things work. Continuous grazing is what we have historically used in, at least in Southern Indiana. This is a very popular way to manage a grazing. It's putting that set of animals out there on what our stocking rates are of 2.5 units per acre or whatever that is for that particular livestock, and leaving them in that same area for the entire year. They move around. They tend to graze on those specific areas. They like to select specific plants, just like anything else. We like chocolate over broccoli, and so we're going to go to the chocolate before the broccoli. There are going to be some sweeter, smaller plants that they really like versus the ones that we want them to eat. They're not going to eat them. So you tend to have a little bit more selectivity. They're going to hang out in one particular place, whether that be in the woods, wood lines, near the watering source, or near your hay bales. And those are going to be your high risk areas for poor soil health and weed infiltrations and management systems that you're going to have to work on. The number of animals that you could graze in that area actually drops because you are looking at the lowest pasture production time of the year as to how to stock it. So if that means in the middle of August, when you're slow, your grass isn't growing as fast, that same number of animals in April are on that pasture at the same time in August. They're still going to need to be able to gather enough nutrients on that pasture in August that they were in April. And so if you can't, then you need to think about what your stocking rate is, or better ways to manage that pasture so that you have a more ability to use the plants that are available to you and your livestock. Drawbacks on continuous grazing, kind of like what we've talked about. You can have some low animal gains per acre. You'll start to see those cows maybe drying up or going a little bit light on their body condition scores towards the end of summer. If you've not weaned off calves yet, that's really going to hurt your calf growth. And you're going to have to think about maybe adding a creep feeder in the pasture to manage those calf gains, as well as keeping them maybe off of the cow a little bit more so that she doesn't get sucked down too low. Your waste of forage mass, biomass, and quality, you're going to have a lot of that tall, greater than 10 inches of growth on your plants. And then of course that nutrient value goes way down, seed heads form, the stem gets thicker and very unpalatable to most animals, and they just won't eat it. And so you're going to reduce the amount of plants that they're going to eat and available to them on a continuous basis. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So our next step down is, of course, rotational grazing, and we've alluded to this, and we're going to go a lot more into depth next week on this. But rotational grazing is dividing that large pasture into smaller paddocks so that we can move those livestock from one to the next and allow a resting period between grazing periods. The time and intensity, like we said, can be controlled based on what your producer's needs. And I can give my example with my sheep. When I first got them, that was in September. I was able to lease about 14 acres of pasture for my 14 ewes. Sounds like a really great number, but if you look at it visually, about 3 acres just next to my barn area was a complete weed mess, an absolute mess. There was some forage in there, but honestly, it needed to be knocked down and cleaned up. And so I used them. I don't have a tractor at that particular location, so that would mean I'd have to haul equipment, mower, whatever. I used them. So I did some really intensive grazing, which we'll talk about here in a minute, to make them push down those big weedy plants that they wouldn't eat to get to the small green plants that they were looking for. That took some time. We had to adjust depending on what was available. When they moved to the next portion, we had a lush stockpile of beautiful fescue. Well, that took them 3 times the amount of days to graze over the weedy pasture. So we just had to manage that space that they were given, as to how long it was taking them to get through that and get it down to about that 4-inch height without hurting it. I lucked out on this, honestly. I couldn't have gotten a better deal where we had some great stockpiled pastures. We got some gross ones that now we can work with this year. But we spent the whole winter playing, figuring out what works the best for the area that we had. We were able to graze, I don't know, 3/4 of the winter. I was able to graze on stockpiled fescues, and other pasture areas, and then just be able to supplement with always having a hay bale. And we just did it that way to where they had the ability to come back up to our sacrifice lot and eat, and go back out and gather up some of the stockpiled forages. So this allowed for us to move them around, keep those plants healthy that we knew we had the ability to grow. It increased our forage productivity. So now that it's nice and green, I'm looking at these pastures and just drooling over the amount of forage and ability I'm going to have to rotate these guys this year. And just thinking of the number of days I'm going to have into the fall, even, I think that I'll be able to graze these guys because we kept them on those spaces on a short amount of time over the winter. Forage stockpiling, like I said, this is allowing for a little bit of growth, getting up to that 8 to 10 inch mark, and then giving them a good pile of forage that maybe is dormant or brown on the top from a frost incident, but still thick enough to where the bottom is green. They've still got some good forage in there to graze and reduce your hay needs. Next. Okay, so manage intensive grazing is even shorter spaces within those rotational management systems. What we've done is we've got 6 different lots built with exterior paneling. And in one particular, I think we managed by strip grazing, which is just moving that fence line forward and allowing them to eat small pieces and strips. And I was moving that fence 1 to 2 times per day until we got through that weed system. But I knew there wasn't a whole lot down there. I wanted to make sure that they had plenty to eat, but they were still working for me and pushing down those bigger weeds that we wanted to just lay down and use as a cover for that bare ground over the winter. Intensive grazing could also mean that you are mixing species together and using their abilities on a larger space. So cattle and sheep, or sheep and goats, or, you know, whatever mixture kind of makes sense for you and what you're interested in growing and producing. You have that a benefit of either putting them in the same lot or grazing them before and after each other, depending on how that goes. So there's lots of different opportunities. Again, being able to play with it, it does add extra time managing those systems and working. So you just have to think about, do you want to spend more time cutting hay, baling hay, and if you have square bales, then you got to throw it in a barn, and then moving it, of course, into the pastures later in the winter? Or do you want to spend some time in the pasture, moving the fences, watching those grasses, and doing some scouting every day? Personally, I enjoy being out there in the pasture with the animals. I enjoy looking and seeing how they're using those nutrients, and it keeps me closer to them. Again, here's a visual on increased stocked density depending on what you're doing. Continuous grazing, you're going to see where they're going to be really compacted in some areas. That's going to end up being around a gate, watering system, or hay feeder. And they're going to move and spread themselves out. When you do a basic rotation, you can cut that field in 4, in half, in 6 pieces. And it's going to tighten that bunch up, and they're going to be forced to eat more. When you do an intensive rotational grazing, it's bunched even tighter, which means you have to manage it a little faster and give them that access to the next part so that they're able to manage those nutrients as best. But that does help with your fertilization, your potential outputs of forage amounts, your density increases. So it really does help you out in the long run. You have less fertilizers you add, less maybe hay management, less mowing that you're able to do.
All right, I had a couple of questions come in real quick, Miranda.
Okay,
So
great.
The first one was kind of answered a little bit, but it was, can you speak to stocking levels for general pasture management versus kind of the intensive situations?
Ooh.
So how many animals can you have? And then how intense can stocking be without animals basically walking through the temporary fences?
Sure. I think that depends on how big your fences are or big your lots are that you build. If you're starting with, say I had those 14 acres and I had 14 ewes on that 14 acres, that sounds pretty great. 1 animal per acre. Most of the time you can do more than that with sheep and goats of small ruminants. With cows, you know, of course, it's like 2.5 cow units per acre. So they're going to eat a little bit more. They're going to need a little more. When you take that same 14 animals down to your basic rotational grazing and even split that 14 acres 4 ways, that's going to increase your units per acre by 1/4 or by 4 rather. And so it's going to take them less time. But honestly, I'm able to keep them and all of the lambs that they've had this year. So now I'm up to not only 14, but I'm up to closer to 30 animals on that same 14 acres. And I'm able to manage them and still see good growth in my pastures that they're holding off on. So you can really tighten up your load. And again, it just depends on how fast you want to go. And honestly, if this is something you're looking at starting, don't buy more animals. Start with what you have. Figure out what works best for what you have. I know now, after going through about 6 months of this, I can probably get about 10, 12 more sheep, ewes, and still be able to manage them, breed them, have kids, have them graze in my space. And we're even going to use like the alleyways between the pastures. And there's cattle that actually graze outside of my 14 acres. So it's kind of an internal paddock. And then there's external paddocks around it. And everything works through alleyways. Well, the cattle just move. They don't stop and graze there. So my sheep are going to get an extra 2 acres-ish just of alleyway grazing. And that's maybe a day, but a day is a day. So use the space you have. I don't like to mow. Guess what they're going to do? They're going to mow my yard too. You know, they may be doing really intensive grazing over a couple of days. That's okay. I don't have to mow.
Right. And then along those same lines, would the stocking rate be relaxed if you wanted to improve the individual gain for those animals?
Sure.
And then would stockers be run as densely as a cow calf or ewe lamb type thing? I think you kind of mentioned that.
Yeah, I think maybe I've covered that. If I didn't, you have more specific questions, let me know. But it depends on your inputs, on what you have. And, you know, with my lambs, I always have a creep feeder available. So they have that extra ability to gain if they feel like they need more to eat. They're going to eat more of that concentrate and drink more milk than they are grazing. So that does help me in the long run. So yeah, I think it just depends on what your inputs are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think definitely if you wanted to have more individual gain, you can definitely drop your numbers down. And then obviously you'd want to drop your size of acreage as well. So yep. That way you have basically the same number. You might be moving them more, but they're able to get a little bit more forage potentially.
Absolutely. So. Yep. And Dr. Johnson just put in the chat, the rule of thumb is the 2 acres per unit.
Yep. All right. Thank you, Miranda.
You're welcome.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started on our next section, talking about kind of overgrazing and how to help prevent it. So we've seen these pictures before. I showed them a couple weeks ago, but which would we rather have? We have these nice, lovely overgrazed situations with our thistle. Looks like some good curly dock, some mustard growing in there. Or would we rather have the nice, lush green pastures, very little weeds, great nutrition? So that's kind of what we have to think about when we're looking at different types of grazing, how we're managing our pastures, things like that. So when we look at the term overgrazing, it's pretty simple to understand. It's basically repeatedly grazing our pastures so low that our plants that we want have a hard time recovering. So basically understanding how our plants function. Each year our plants go through kind of a cycle. So in the spring, they utilize stored reserves to start manufacturing energy, to start undergoing photosynthesis, things like that to start growing. Throughout the year, they also help kind of put aside a few reserves as well to help if there's a drought, if there's a little bit of overgrazing, if they are mowed, if there's a fire that goes through, things like that. So all those things kind of disrupt their regular energy in the leaves, and those extra reserves get utilized for that regrowth. So a lot of plants have factored that extra reserve, that extra growth or disruption into their annual growth cycle. So they have those reserves tucked away. However, when we're continuously grazing those plants down to 3 inches, 2 inches, 1 inch, bare ground, we're repeatedly taking away those reserves. It takes longer for that plant to recover. It takes longer for them to start processing photosynthesis, to start gaining energy. So that is why it takes longer for our desirable plants to recover in an overgrazed situation. So Dr. John Ernest Weaver from University of Nebraska started doing work on studying grazing and overgrazing back in the 1940s. So this is 80 years ago they were studying this. So he and his students would dig trenches about 15 feet deep. So that back then that was pretty much by hand they were digging these. And they'd look at the plant roots, look at drawings, things like that. And what they were finding is that those areas that were overgrazed, those plants lost 35 to 70% of their roots. That's huge. Those plants are a lot of their nutrients from the soil. So when they lose 70% of basically, you could say their silverware, how they're getting those nutrients, that's a lot. So that would be like if you lost your spoon and your fork and you only had a knife to eat with. Make things a little bit more difficult. So when we're looking at overgrazing, there are some things that we need to consider that are basically harsher on our pastures. So the first thing is our plants can't really recover or regrow as quickly, if at all. So the biggest thing with overgrazing is we have our loss of leaves. So the leaves are where we get most of our nutrients, where most of the nutrients are produced because of the photosynthesis. So basically we can consider that kind of our solar panel for our plants. That's where they collect their energy, they get their batteries charged up to grow, things like that. So if you can imagine here, looking at this picture, we've got some nice clover, looks like some Kentucky bluegrass possibly, and then we have some other weeds, looks like some maybe Queen Anne's lace and some other things starting to peek through. So if we're routinely grazing this pasture down, if you think of a white clover, like what might be in our yards, they get 3-4 inches tall. If you're routinely taking that top, that solar panel, those leaves off, they have that little stem, and that's what they have to start photosynthesizing from. It's a lot more difficult to get a lot of energy from that little stem than with our leaves out like this. So the more energy it takes for them to get going, the more chance those weeds have to sprout up faster and overtake that area and shade them out. So these next couple of pictures I thought were great examples. So this one was from University of Florida, featured in the On Pasture magazine. It shows how our regrowth is compromised, shows what Dr. Weaver was talking about, how when those fields, those pastures are routinely overgrazed, those root systems just disappear. So we can see on the right-hand side, we've got a pasture or a field in the experiment where it was cut down to 2 inches about every 4 weeks, but it gave that plant plenty of time to recover, to regrow, to get its energy restored and going again. And we can see that root system looks pretty healthy. It's nice and white, got some great length to it, things like that. Middle section, we've got 2 inches about every 2 weeks. So that might be getting a little more intensive on our grazing. We're cutting it more often, but we still have a halfway decent system. But you can see that middle section, get my pen here or my mouse, you can see this middle section here, we don't have near the length that we do on the right picture. The middle one, you've got a little bit of length, you've got some smaller tillers here, but that's about it. And so when we go ahead and move to this very left photo, where it was cut to 2 inches every week, that would be like Miranda said, that animal coming in, maybe it's a lush choice area, they love that plant and they're going to come back routinely time after time and eat it. And you can just see how detrimental that has been to that root system. So this is another great picture from Canada, showing again just that great length. Here on the right was most likely like a native prairie that's had time to grow, not really disturbed a whole lot. A fantastic root system. That's a phenomenal root system. The one in the middle here, probably similar to what our last picture was, where it was cut maybe to 2 or 3 inches about every month or so. A great root system again. Over here, one more to the left, we've got maybe cut a little more often, but not overgrazed. You can see the root system just is not nearly as abundant as the rest. And then we have our overgraze situation. There's just not much root there. So we have to remember, the deeper those roots grow, the more nutrients they get, the more carbohydrates they can store, the more they have. So those pictures, I think, really demonstrate kind of what overgrazing does to our pastures, more than what we can just see on the surface. And then we have our weeds. So the weeds definitely begin to appear and multiply when we aren't managing our pastures under more potentially rotational grazing or under a better system. So we see here on the left, this was a study at University of Wisconsin. This was kind of more of a rotationally based. They were stocking their pastures maybe a little bit more denser. So they were keeping those weeds down. They were rotating more routinely. So it was managed more properly, taking them off those pastures at maybe about 3.5, 4 inch height, coming back in at proper times. So you can see it looks like a nice, lush green pasture. We're not seeing many weeds, something that an animal's probably going to enjoy. Versus the right-hand side, that would be more of our continuous grazing, where you've kind of eaten those plants down to the point where those weeds start taking over because our desirable species just have not had a chance to recover. They haven't had a chance to get their solar panels out and going, so they can't restore those carbohydrates, and those weeds have just shot up. It looks like there's a lot of good thistle in there, which is not something that most of our animals are going to thoroughly enjoy. And then probably one of the biggest things, especially for maybe southern Indiana, maybe if we're looking at out in Nebraska, some of the Flint Hills, things like that, is the runoff, soil erosion, and evaporation issues. So this is a great example here. This is actually from Canada. You can see that it looks like the grass is pretty much completely almost gone. You can see there's not much of a root system here. So when we have some of these 20, 50, 100-year rain events, if it's on hilly ground, that soil is getting washed away. So we can see here, we can get different types of erosion. So our gully, our rill, our inner rill, things like that. So we're losing that valuable topsoil, that organic matter that's been built up. We're losing it. you're losing that grass as well. So an example of that is at my parents' farm. So we have a county creek that runs basically halfway through the property. So this last, what was it? Would have been spring of last year. We had a couple of massive, like 2, 3, 4-inch rain events. And one of their pastures runs right against that creek, and it completely washed away the bank of that creek from the force of that water coming under the road and hitting that bank before it curved off. Completely eroded away. That's what they lost, I think, about 7 foot of their pasture because of that. Wasn't because the pasture wasn't managed well, it was just because of the force of the water. And so water can have a major issue if we don't have good soil, good roots. And then it might seem kind of counterintuitive, but actually the less roots, the less grass you have in the ground, really the less water infiltration you can actually have into that ground. So like Miranda said, in some of our kind of dry lot areas, it might get a little bit muddier, a little bit muckier, but that's because there's less grass. We have, as we saw in the pictures before, we'll have less roots. And really those roots provide water channels for that water to get into the soil, to get down in, to get good drainage down into our soils and to stay there. So the less roots there are, the more compaction there is, the harder it is for that water to seep into the ground. So that's why we see here in this example, we've got the cattle around the hay field or the hay manger, and it's just a mucky mess. But we'll talk about kind of some solutions here in just a couple of minutes. And then, like Miranda said, our animals suffer because they eat less. It's harder for them to find the nutrition that they need. It's hard for them, they have to travel more, so they're using more energy to get what nutrition they can. So it's just harder on the animals, harder on the land, things like that. So we get less pounds gained per day, which means it takes us longer for them to go ahead and finish out. So it means we're feeding them more. It means we're having to spend more money, and it takes us longer to get them to either the processor or to market. And we're going to have less of a profit, if any profit at all. So it's kind of our downside, but we do have some tips, some ways to prevent it, some ways to help with our overgrazing, so that way we can get those nice, lush green pastures, have more positive profit, positive animals, things like that. So the first could be supplementing with hay or hailage, like we've talked about the last couple of weeks. So like Miranda said, making sure we have kind of that dry lot, that sacrifice area set aside. So if we do get those wet few days, we do get those months during the winter when stuff just does not seem to dry out, we can use these dry lot areas. So Brian had made a great point, reminded me that sometimes in these dry lot areas, and Miranda had said as well, that we can use areas, put gravel in, utilize potentially some NRCS funding, some EQIP grants, things like that, to help create some of these high use pad areas where you can put it in, where it's easier to scrape that manure off. So that manure is not causing runoff issues, things like that, where it's easier to manage kind of those areas so it might not be as muddy. But this way we can have a good kind of dry-ish area for our animals to go, but we aren't wasting our pastures. We aren't causing compaction issues. We aren't causing issues with the plants basically being stomped into the ground. So, and as long as you're making your hay and hailage to good quality, they should maintain their body weight and capacity as well. We can also intensify our grazing management. So going from that continuous grazing into the rotational or the managed intensive grazing, like Miranda discussed, and we'll speak a little bit more next week. But this is just kind of an interesting picture again from University of Wisconsin. We can kind of see over here on the left where our continuous grazing was. We've got a lot of great Queen Anne's lace coming up in there, some more thistle. it just looks brown and kind of dead, and just maybe it looks like an overcooked steak. Versus kind of in here, they've managed some weeds using herbicides, which is certainly an option. It may be a little more difficult to kind of keep our animals off if there's a restriction period for animals not to graze, but that's an option as well. We can see kind of here towards the back where they have rotationally grazed. We still have some weeds in there, but we're seeing some nice grass growth. And then over here on the right-hand side, we see some mob grazed. So not nearly the amount of Queen Anne's lace, a lot more of the lush green grass, similar to what we see here with the herbicide use. So if we intensify our grazing, giving those paddocks time to rest, give our desirable forages time to grow, we can manage some of those weeds kind of more of a natural way. We may also need to adjust our stock numbers. So if we're having a year where we're having a drought, that's what right now, Northern Indiana, we're still in a drought. The best that we got this winter was abnormally dry, but we're back to a drought status up here. We just have not gotten the precipitation that Southern Indiana has got, that some of our neighboring states have got. We're dry. I've had a few farmers this week that have just started planting corn, but when they're working ground, that dust is flying. So for the first week of April, that's pretty concerning. I'm getting a little concerned about our hay pastures this year. They look great coming up right now, but I don't know what they're going to look like after that first cutting. So we need some moisture. But if you have pastures where you're having issues, where you just don't have the mass yield, you don't have the forages there, you may need to sell off some of your animals. It's a possibility. So here several years ago, maybe last year, out in the Dakotas, things like that, they were having an awful drought. So people were just starting to sell their beef animals left and right. There were people waiting in line at the livestock auctions for 3 or 4 hours to offload their animals. It's awful to think about, but it's something that needs to be considered if you don't have the amount of forage that you need, or even the hay to raise those quality animals. Then again, we need to think about our vegetation regrowth, like I've talked about. So we want to leave that appropriate amount of vegetation to get our solar panels up and going, to get that photosynthesis working, to get that energy restored to that plant so it can grow back again. So again, we want to leave about 3.5 inches at least, if not more. So we can see here that when we remove at least 50% of the plant, basically our roots kind of stop growing. They go kind of into a dormant stage until we get that energy restored, that photosynthesis working again. When you take 70% of that plant material away, those roots stop growing for 17 days. That's just shy of, that's basically over that's 2.5 weeks. That's a long time frame for that plant to get recharged, to get growing again. That's a lot of a grazing season. And then when you look at when you remove 90% of that plant, so taking it down to maybe an inch, all of the roots stop growing for 17 days. So that middle section, we have 50% of the roots that stop growing. So you still have a little bit of energy going. The right-hand side, 90% of that plant material taken away, all of your roots are going to stop growing. So that plant is going to have a much harder time recovering and getting going again. And then, like Miranda alluded to, diversifying our forage species. So like we've talked about before several times, kind of like they say, you need to hear something 7 times before it really clicks and sets in. So we have our growth curves of our various forages here. So we can see where they grow at different times. This is from University of Georgia. So we can kind of shift this a little bit. And so if we shift our curve a little bit to the right here, but let's say April timeframe, our cool season grasses really start growing, kind of June, July, August, September timeframe. We have our warm season perennials really growing. We can get some winter annuals in there. So it's really great if we can diversify our species. We can rotate them through as they're the most nutritious, as the nutrition is most available for our animals, and just keep everybody growing and happy. And then once again, like we've said many times over, make sure we're looking at our proper soil fertility. I'm not going to hound this very much, but just making sure we're checking our soil fertility, making sure our pH is proper, making sure we have the right nutrient levels on our soils, just to help those plants get the energy, get up and moving, things like that. I had a producer in here just last couple of weeks that showed me some of his forage tests or soil tests that he got from the previous owner that were, I think, 2 years old. The pH on that soil, the lowest it was 7.2. It was a dairy, yeah, it was for up here in Northeast Indiana. That's incredibly high. And so it was from a dairy farm was who he purchased it from. So I'm sure they just pumped that manure on it. I think it's probably an alfalfa field prior to it. So that's even getting a little bit high for our alfalfa. But I was looking at that pH and I'm like, oh, it's going to be really hard to get some of our grasses to grow in there. So we're working with him and a couple of our local elevators to try to get that ground managed a little bit better so he can get a great rotation. But just making sure you know what's in your soil so you can get those forages growing. So great question from Joyce. So are we mixing our cool season and warm season grasses in the same lots or dividing them up? So really, usually most of our warm season, there are a few perennial warm season, but most of our warm season grasses that grow best will be annuals. And so we will kind of do a kind of set aside area, maybe a smaller lot size. So let's say we have a 20 acre lot that we can do stuff with. If we set aside maybe 12, 14 acres and do cool season grasses there, because the majority of our grazing is going to be doing during that cooler month. So let's say mid-April to June timeframe, and then come back in mid-August to potentially having stockpiled through December. So we're going to have a lot more cool season forages that are going to be used, but you could take that other 5, 6, 7 acres and do some annual or some summer annuals in it. So do things like our sorghum Sudan, some pearl millets, some turnips, some radishes, things like that. So that way we give our cool season a little bit of a break during those hotter months when they're going to be more dormant, when it's going to take them longer to recover. Just like us during the hotter months of the summer, unloading a hay wagon with 80-pound bales when it's maybe 65 with a nice little breeze versus 90 with 80% humidity, it takes a lot more out of you. So you want to kind of set that aside, give those species a chance that grow better in the warm weather, a chance to flourish. So you give those cool season a break. So kind of my parting thoughts for today, and I'll let Miranda kind of add in as well if she has any others, but basically our overgrazing leads to less plants, less desirable plants. We can have less soil because if that soil is exposed, our organic matter, our topsoil is going to blow away. And we have less desirable feed, less nutritious feed for our animals. So we can help properly manage our pastures, keep those grazing heights to a good height, have good lush forage there for our animals routinely. If not, kind of pulling them off, having that dry lot area, the hailage, the hay available for them to use, potentially reducing our stocking rates, so selling off some animals if need be. Those can all help kind of reduce our overgrazing, help kind of just make our pastures greener and happier throughout the year. So, okay. So if there are any other questions, we'd be happy to answer them at this time. So do you have anything to add, Dr. Johnson?
He did put a nice comment in the chat of he'd prefer a pH of 7 as compared to a 5.5. So
yeah,
a lot of times down here we see that people will just put lime on every year, whether they know they need it or not. And I have recently started seeing some of those higher 7.2, 7.5. And I guess it's concerning to me because it takes a lot more time to get it back down than it does to get it up that high. So I really try to help people understand that, you know, I give them those graphs that we're looking at. Why is the nutrients availability so important and entwined in that pH level, and why those plants are doing better at a lower pH level versus that higher 7.5. So I'll tell you on this cool mixing of cool season and warm season plants. I can maybe give a little example of what I intend to do this year. I purchased some warm annuals, and I've got a, well, the lot that I was able to just intensively graze and cover with the weed material. Right now, that's got some burdock and things popping up on it. And so I'm probably going to take all of those warm annuals and do a seeding of warm annuals on there for my ewes, and then go back with cover crops and then a pasture mix next year, knowing that I'm be able to work that soil and maybe help it a little bit by putting in one crop versus trying to go in right now and do my pasture mix and hope that it's going to come out okay. So I'll take my time to do the nutrients, make sure the fertilizer is applied, do those warm summer or those summer annuals through about June to about, you know, whenever they're able to get off of that, and then go back in and do my cover crops this fall prior to putting the pasture mix on next year. So those are some ideas and things. If you've got something that you really think you need to renovate, maybe look at that as an opportunity to change and put something new on there. That might help with the nutrients in the long run. And then add a legume to it as well. That's going to stay. That probably won't get hurt by your cover crop too bad. Try testing, trying. You know, like I said, I spent the entire winter trying different things, and that's what I suggest to people is take some of this detail, take some of this information and try it. If it doesn't work, doesn't mean it's not for you. It just means maybe it's not the right plan, and making some adjustments. And we're here to help answer those questions too.
Yep. So I've just popped up a little poll if you guys could take that real quick. But yeah, so we see it all, not just Indiana, but all across the US, just driving around, you see those overgrazed pastures and things like that. So if this can help even one person, I think we've succeeded.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, all right. So like we said, next week we'll come back and kind of talk more intensely about rotational grazing, managed intensive grazing, things like that. And then also discuss some of the great resources that are out there for forage producers, some of the other agencies, things like that, that are out there in organizations. So, all right, well, if there are any other questions, we're happy to stay on and answer them. Otherwise, have a fantastic weekend. Have a wonderful week until we see you again next week, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.